You know, um, when you stand on a high vantage point and look down at a massive city, right?
Yeah.
You see the skyscrapers, the highways, the shipping containers stacked like colorful blocks at the port. It all looks incredibly solid.
Oh, absolutely. It looks like pure engineering.
Exactly. You see the trucks moving, the smoke rising from a factory, people streaming in and out of office buildings. But what you are really seeing is just the skin and bones of the economy.
That is a great way to put it.
Right. Because what remains completely invisible to the naked eye is the cardiovascular system, the actual blood pumping through those veins.
The invisible flow of value that makes the entire colossal machine keep moving.
Yes, exactly. And we see the physical objects, the commodities themselves, but we are completely blind to the circuits they're traveling through. The architecture of that movement is entirely hidden from our everyday perception.
It really is. It's just entirely under the surface.
So today we are going on a deep dive into the invisible blood of the economy. We are looking at this through the lens of Karl Marx's Capital, specifically Volume 2, Book 1.
Right, which is titled The Process of Circulation of Capital.
Exactly. And just as a quick disclaimer, before we really get into the weeds here, because, this text is inherently tied to some very politically charged historical and economic debates.
Oh, heavily charged.
Right. So we are not taking sides or endorsing any political viewpoints here, left or right. Our mission today is strictly to explore and understand the mechanics of this economic theory exactly as it's presented in the source material. We just want to unpack the blueprint.
And honestly, to even understand that blueprint, you have to look at the absolute nightmare that his lifelong collaborator, Friedrich Engels, faced trying to actually publish this text.
Oh, man, yes. This was in 1885, right, like a couple of years after Marx died.
Yeah, exactly. And the editorial burden Engels describes in his preface to the first edition is just, it's staggering.
Because he wasn't exactly handed a neatly stacked pile of polished chapters, was he?
Not even close. He was handed a mountain of fragmentary texts, notebooks, scattered manuscripts. Most of it hadn't been polished for language at all.
Wow.
Yeah, Engels describes this really careless style full of colloquialisms, coarse humor, and this totally chaotic mix of English, French, and German technical terms.
Wait, he was just mixing languages in the middle of sentences?
Oh, yeah. Marx would routinely write whole pages in English right in the middle of a complex German sentence.
That sounds like a complete headache for an editor. It's like the equivalent of trying to assemble a coherent, world-changing masterwork out of a brilliant but highly erratic friend's scattered diary entries.
And late-night margin notes.
Right. You have notebooks dating back to 1861, manuscripts from 1865, deep revisions from 1870.
And keep in mind, all of this was written in Marx's notoriously unreadable handwriting.
Which I read sometimes even he couldn't decipher.
That's true. So Engels had to stitch all of this into a unified theory of circulation while trying to present the final thoughts exclusively in the author's voice.
That is quite the burden.
It really was.
Yeah.
But Engels points out that this wasn't just, sloppiness on Marx's part. It was the direct result of this intense, almost paralyzing self-criticism.
Combined with an ever-widening horizon of study, right?
Exactly. Marx would hit a theoretical wall in his economic models, and he would simply stop writing to go dive into entirely different fields.
Like what kind of fields?
Well, he would spend months studying agronomics, or the intricate details of rural land relations in Russia, or geology, physiology, even the day-to-day mechanics of the London money market.
So Engels is wrestling with a text that was constantly evolving, constantly being interrupted by the author's need to understand every single variable in the physical world before committing to a theoretical law.
That's exactly it. And almost immediately upon taking on this monumental task, Engels finds himself having to defend the entire foundation of the work against a massive controversy.
Right, the plagiarism accusation. This is fascinating. Let's unpack this before we dive into the actual economic formulas.
Yeah, we have to establish what Marx actually claimed to have discovered first. So this accusation surrounded Johann Karl Rodbertus.
He was a German economist, right?
Yes. And his followers were making a lot of noise in the 1880s. They were loudly claiming that Marx had essentially plagiarized his core concept from Rodbertus's earlier works from the late 1830s and early 40s.
And didn't Rodbertus himself write letters complaining about it?
He did. He claimed he had been robbed by Marx without receiving any credit.
That is a massive claim. How does Engels deal with that in the preface?
He dedicates a significant portion of it to utterly dismantling the accusation. He basically traces the concept of surplus value back much further than Rodbertus ever reached.
So he says you didn't invent this either.
Exactly. Engels points out that the foundational thinkers of classical economics people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, they were already perfectly aware that profit came from a deduction of the worker's labor.
Okay, so it wasn't a secret.
Not at all. Engels pulls up highly specific historical evidence to prove this. He brings up an obscure 1821 anonymous pamphlet.
Anonymous pamphlet.
Yeah, it was a letter addressed to Lord John Russell. And that pamphlet explicitly argues that whatever the capitalist takes as interest and profit is paid entirely out of the labor of others.
Wow, so decades before Rodbertus.
Decades. The pamphlet even argues that if a laborer could be forced to subsist on cheaper food, like, say, potatoes instead of bread, the capitalist could extract more surplus labor from them.
So the realization that profit was essentially unpaid labor was already thoroughly embedded in the intellectual ether way before Rodbertus wrote a single word.
Right. Adam Smith had already identified it as a deduction, and David Ricardo had built his entire theoretical framework on the premise that value is derived from labor.
Which puts us in a really interesting position when looking at this text, because if Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and random anonymous pamphleteers in the 1820s already fully understood that profit was just a deduction from the worker's labor, what is Marx's actual breakthrough?
That is the crucial question.
Right. If he didn't invent the idea that workers produce the profit, we have to isolate what his monumental contribution to this field actually is.
And to clarify exactly what Marx achieved, Engels deploys this brilliant analogy from the history of chemistry. It perfectly frames the distinction between observing a phenomenon and actually understanding its underlying mechanism.
I love this analogy. It's about the discovery of oxygen, right?
Yes. Engels asks the reader to look at the discovery of oxygen in the late 18th century. At that time, the prevailing scientific consensus around combustion was the phlogiston theory.
Phlogiston. Okay, remind us what that means.
So the entire scientific community believed that when a substance burned, it was releasing a hypothetical fire substance called phlogiston into the surrounding air. Fire was viewed as something violently escaping from the wood or the coal.
Okay, so fire is a thing that leaves the object. Got it.
Right. Then, in 1774, the English chemist Joseph Priestley conducted experiments where he successfully produced a very pure kind of gas.
He isolated oxygen.
He did. But Priestley was theoretically trapped in the old way of thinking. When he isolated this gas, he looked at it through the lens of phlogiston theory and called it dephlogisticated air.
Because he thought it was just air that was missing its fire substance.
Exactly. And shortly after, the Swedish chemist Karl Wilhelm Scheele independently produced the exact same gas and called it fire air.
So they both held the discovery in their hands. They had physically isolated oxygen.
But they had absolutely no idea what they were looking at because they remained prisoners of the phlogiston categories they had inherited from their predecessors.
They discovered the element, but they didn't comprehend it.
Right. Then Antoine Lavoisier in Paris enters the picture. Priestley communicates his findings about this dephlogisticated air to Lavoisier.
And what does Lavoisier do?
He examines the gas, but instead of trying to contort it to fit into the established phlogiston theory, he realizes the prevailing theory itself is entirely backwards.
Oh, wow.
He realizes this isn't air that has lost its phlogiston. This is a brand new, distinct chemical element. And combustion isn't a mysterious substance escaping it. It is the process of this new element, oxygen, actively combining with the burning body.
So Lavoisier didn't discover oxygen first. The others beat him to the physical isolation of the gas.
Correct. But Lavoisier was the first to understand what it actually was. And by doing so, he completely revolutionized the entire field of chemistry. The old paradigm was just dead.
And Engels maps this directly onto the history of economics.
Perfectly. Adam Smith and David Ricardo are Priestley and Scheele. They had isolated the economic equivalent of oxygen. They looked at the economy and saw clearly that workers produced more value than they were given back in wages.
But they remained trapped in their inherited economic categories.
Yes. They looked at this excess value and simply called it profit or rent or interest. They called it phlogiston.
They saw the fire, but they didn't understand the chemical reaction causing it.
Exactly. Marx, in this analogy, is Lavoisier. Marx didn't discover that workers produce a surplus. What he did was isolate surplus value as a general foundational category, entirely separate from its specific subforms like industrial profit or ground rent.
So by isolating it, he was able to analyze the entire capitalist system from a completely new vantage point.
Right. He looked at value itself, recognized it as a social representation of congealed labor time, and used this clear, newly isolated element of surplus value to unlock the contradictions that had entirely stumped the Ricardian school of economics.
Okay, let's talk about the major contradiction that stumped Ricardo, because it's something that still confuses people today.
It really does.
If we assume the market is generally fair, like that commodities exchange at their true value, then how does profit exist at all?
That is the million-dollar question.
If a capitalist buys raw materials at their true value and buys labor at its true value and sells the finished product at its true value, where does the extra money come from? It mathematically shouldn't exist if equivalents are being exchanged.
And that specific contradiction is what destroyed the Ricardian school. The classical economists essentially had to admit that either commodities don't exchange at their value, or the whole theory of labor value is flawed.
So how did Marx solve this?
He solved it by introducing a vital distinction that Engels points out Rodbertus and the classical economists completely missed. And it revolves around the precise definition of what the capitalist is actually purchasing when they hire someone.
Right, because the instinctive assumption is that a capitalist is buying a worker's labor. Like, I work for 8 hours, you pay me for 8 hours of my labor. The exchange seems totally straightforward.
But the text argues that labor itself actually has no value.
Wait, labor has no value. How does that work?
The text provides a physical analogy here. Labor is an activity that creates value. Therefore, to say labor has value is a logical impossibility.
Oh, I see.
It makes as much sense as saying gravity has a specific weight, or that heat has a specific temperature. Gravity causes weight, it cannot be weighed. Labor creates value, it cannot have a value of its own.
Okay, so if the capitalist isn't buying labor, because labor is just the ongoing activity of creation, what is actually being bought and sold on the open market?
What is bought and sold is labor power.
Labor power.
Yes, the capacity, the potential, the physical and mental ability to work. And as soon as you recognize that labor power is a distinct commodity, its value is determined by the exact same laws as any other commodity on the market.
So, like, the value of a machine is determined by the labor required to build it.
Exactly. The value of a machine is determined by the socially necessary labor required to build it. The value of labor power is determined by the socially necessary labor required to produce and reproduce the worker.
Meaning the aggregate cost of the food, the housing, the clothing, the basic training, everything required to keep that human being alive, functioning, and capable of returning to the factory the next day.
Plus enough to raise the next generation of workers.
Right. So the capitalist pays for the cost to keep the worker operational.
Yes. The cost to maintain your labor power for a day might be mathematically equivalent to, say, 4 hours of average societal labor. So the capitalist pays you a daily wage equivalent to those 4 hours.
And that is considered a fair exchange of equivalents on the market.
It is. They bought a commodity, your labor power, at its exact true value.
But the capitalist doesn't use that commodity for only 4 hours. They bought the use of it for the entire day.
Exactly. They put you in the factory and have you operate the machinery for 10 hours.
Oh, okay.
Those extra 6 hours, the difference between the value of the labor power itself and the value that the labor power can actively create once it is put to use, that is the surplus value. That is the oxygen.
Wow. So Marx solved the Ricardian contradiction by showing how a perfectly fair exchange of equivalents in the marketplace mathematically results in the creation of surplus value inside the factory.
Exactly. Buying labor power at its true value results in a surplus during its use.
It fundamentally changes the lens through which you view an economic transaction. So with surplus value isolated as the oxygen of the system, we can actually track how this oxygen flows through the body.
Right.
And this is where the text introduces the 3 distinct circuits of capital, beginning with the circuit of money capital.
Yes, the first circuit. The formula for the circuit of money capital is laid out as M-C dots P dots C prime dash M prime.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener. The circuit starts with M representing money. The capitalist possesses a sum of money and takes it to the commodity market.
Correct.
That initial act of purchasing is represented as M-C. Money is transformed into commodities.
But the specific use character of those commodities is what defines this as capital. If you take your money and buy a luxury carriage for your own enjoyment, the money has merely acted as a medium of exchange. It ceases to be capital.
Because it's just a personal purchase.
Right. To function as capital, the C in the formula must represent 2 very specific elements. First, L for labor power, and second, MP for means of production, which is the raw materials and the machinery.
So M-C is the capitalist deliberately assembling the specific physical ingredients required for a production process. Money is converted into the potential for production.
Then we hit the dots in the formula. M-C dots P. Those dots are conceptually crucial
Why are the dots so important?
because they indicate that the process of circulation, the buying and selling on the open market, is temporarily suspended. The capitalist takes the purchased commodities out of the sphere of circulation and forces them to interact in the sphere of production, represented by P.
This is the factory floor. This is where the human being actively applies their labor power to the machinery and the raw materials.
Yes. And this is the only place in the entire circuit where the oxygen is actively generated.
Okay, so out of the other end of that production process comes C prime. The prime, or apostrophe, designates that this is a newly created commodity.
Exactly. It has been altered in its physical substance, but more importantly, it is mathematically greater in value than the sum of the original elements.
Because it contains the original capital value advanced for the materials and the wages, plus the newly generated surplus value.
Right. The capitalist then takes this swollen commodity back into the sphere of circulation, back to the market. They sell C prime and receive M prime, which represents the original money advance plus the profit.
More money.
More money. The overarching flow is initiating a process with money, solely for the purpose of ending the process with a larger sum of money. M to M prime.
Okay, but the text demands that we look extremely closely at the prerequisites for this entire circuit, particularly that very first step, right? M-C, specifically the act of buying labor power, M-L.
Yes, because on the surface, this looks like a simple, natural transaction between two equal parties. Someone has money, someone else needs a job, a contract is signed.
But the text says this simple transaction implies a massive tectonic shift in human history.
It does. For M-L to occur on a societal scale, there must exist a vast population of workers who have been completely separated from their own means of production.
Meaning they don't own their own land or tools.
Exactly. Because if a person owns their own plot of land or possesses their own weaving loom, they will simply produce their own commodities and sell them directly on the market. They will engage in simple commodity exchange.
They will not voluntarily submit to selling their labor power to a capitalist for a daily wage.
Right. Capitalist production intrinsically requires what the text refers to as free labor. And the word free is deployed with the profound double meaning here.
A double meaning. Like what?
Well, first, the worker must be legally free to sell their labor power. They cannot be a slave or a serf tied to a lord. But simultaneously, they must be free from the ownership of any means of production.
Oh, I see. Free from having any other option.
Exactly. They must be stripped of any independent access to land, raw materials, or machinery that would allow them to survive without selling themselves to the capitalist.
That is a brutal double meaning. And the text actually highlights a vivid historical example of this structural necessity, examining the situation of Russian landowners right after the emancipation of the serfs in 1861.
Yes. So the Emancipation decreed that the serfs were now legally free. The Russian landowners, looking at the immense wealth of the British industrial system, decided they wanted to transition their estates to capitalist agriculture.
They wanted to cease being feudal lords, extracting forced tribute, and become modern agricultural capitalists, utilizing wage laborers.
Right. But they ran into two insurmountable walls.
What was the first one?
The first complaint they lodged was a lack of money capital. They didn't have enough liquid cash to pay wages to a massive workforce throughout the long growing season before the crops could finally be harvested and sold.
Okay, cash flow issues. Makes sense.
But the second complaint is what truly illustrates the mechanism of the M-L transaction. The landowners complained that even when they managed to secure the necessary money capital, they simply couldn't find enough laborers willing to be hired.
Why not? Weren't they legally free now?
They were, but the reason was structural. The newly emancipated Russian peasants were still legally tied to the mir, the traditional village community land.
Oh, so they still had access to land.
Exactly. The peasants hadn't been fully separated from the means of production. Because they still had access to communal land where they could grow their own food and sustain themselves, they were not free in the second sense.
They were not desperate enough to submit to wage labor.
The capitalist circuit, M-C, literally could not function in that environment. The money could not transform into productive capital because the specific social conditions weren't present.
That is fascinating. So the free worker, devoid of any alternative means of survival, is not a natural occurrence. It is a strict historical prerequisite that must be violently or legally established before the circuit can begin to flow.
Right. But once those conditions are established, the mathematical engine of the circuit can roar to life. And the text provides a meticulous breakdown of this, using the example of a spinning mill tasked with producing 10,000 pounds of yarn.
Let's walk the listener through this math because it really crystallizes the theory.
Okay, so the capitalist initiates the circuit by advancing a total value of 422 pounds. This 422 pounds is our starting M. It represents the total capital available for 1 week of operation.
Okay, so the capitalist then executes M-C. They divide that 422 pounds into two distinct purchases.
Yes, they spend 372 pounds on the means of production. This covers the physical cotton to be spun, the coal required to power the steam engine, and the calculated wear and tear on the spinning machinery over the course of that specific week.
And the text categorizes this 372 pounds as constant capital, right?
Correct. It's constant because it doesn't add any new value to the final product. The value of the 372 pounds worth of cotton, coal, and machine wear is simply preserved and transferred into the 10,000 pounds of yarn. It merely changes its physical shape.
Okay, so out of the 422, we have 50 pounds left.
Right. The remaining 50 pounds is spent on labor power. This covers the wages of the spinning workforce for the week. The text categorizes this 50 pounds as variable capital because this is the active, subjective element.
This is the labor power that will actually generate new value beyond what it costs to maintain.
Exactly. The capitalist has transformed their 422 pounds into the potential for production. They have their dead materials and their living labor. They now enter the P phase, the factory doors close, and production begins.
Okay, so during the week of spinning, the workers apply their labor. Their labor transfers the 372 pounds of constant capital value directly into the yarn.
Yes. But because the capitalists purchased their labor power for the full week, the workers are compelled to work past the point necessary to simply replace the 50 pounds of their wages.
So through their surplus labor, they create, for example, 128 pounds of entirely new value.
Right, so we subtract the 50 pounds paid in wages from that 128 pounds of newly created value, leaving a remainder of 78 pounds.
And that 78 pounds is the extracted surplus value.
That's the oxygen. When the week ends, the C prime, the 10,000 pounds of finished yarn, emerges from the factory.
Let's tally up the total value of that C prime. It's the 372 pounds of transferred material value, plus the 50 pounds of replaced wage value, plus the 78 pounds of surplus value. The total value of the commodity is 500 pounds.
Perfect. So the capitalist takes this 500 pounds worth of yarn back to the market, executes C prime-M prime, and receives 500 pounds in cash.
They started the week with 422 pounds, and they end the week with 500. The circuit is complete, and the capital has successfully expanded.
And the text emphasizes the stark reality of the ratio embedded within this process. The workers were paid 50 pounds for their labor power, but their actual labor generated 128 pounds in new value, yielding 78 pounds of pure, unpaid surplus for the capitalist.
That represents an exploitation rate of exactly 156%.
Exactly. The workers spent more time generating free value for the capitalists than they did generating the value of their own survival.
That is wild when you break down the numbers like that. But the text also points out a profound cognitive illusion generated by this specific circuit.
Yes, it does. Because the formula starts with M and ends with M prime. The entire middle section, the actual physical production and the exploitation of labor, tends to vanish from the perception of the capitalist and the economist.
Because it just looks like money breeding money.
Precisely. The circuit creates the overwhelming illusion that money possesses a magical intrinsic property to simply breed more money. It makes the arduous, messy process of production look like a mere unavoidable nuisance, a temporary detour between the bank and the market.
And this specific illusion is what birthed the early mercantile systems of economic thought, right?
Yes, they genuinely believed that value was created in the realm of circulation simply by buying cheap and selling dear, completely ignoring the extraction of surplus value on the factory floor.
If you only look at the first and last step, it looks like a slot machine. You put money in, you pull a lever, more money comes out. The actual physical reality of the C prime, the 10,000 pounds of yarn, seems almost incidental to the process.
Yeah, completely incidental.
But wait, this makes me wonder about something. Does this formula only apply to physical goods? What if a capitalist is running an enterprise that produces no physical object at all, like a railway network or a shipping line? What happens to the yarn then?
That is a great question. And the text actually anticipates this and directly addresses the exception. It references the analysis of a Russian economist named A. Chuprov regarding the transportation industry.
Okay, what does he say?
He says the underlying mechanics of the formula hold entirely, but its outward appearance is slightly altered. For the transportation industry, the formula becomes M-C dots P-M prime.
The C prime is absent.
It is absent because in the transportation industry, what the capitalist is selling is not a physical object, but a change of location.
Oh, that makes sense.
The useful effect of the train ride or the shipping route cannot be stored in a warehouse or displayed on a shelf. The act of production and the act of consumption occur simultaneously. The passenger consumes the transport while the train is actively producing it.
But the valuation works the exact same way, right? The exchange value of that transport is still strictly determined by the cost of the constant capital, the coal burn, the physical wear and tear on the locomotive, plus the surplus value extracted from the surplus labor of the train engineers and conductors.
Exactly. The extraction of the oxygen is identical. It simply occurs without a physical container to carry the surplus value back to the market. The production process itself is sold directly for M prime.
That perfectly bridges the gap to the next section. We've examined the flow of capital from the perspective of the initial monetary investment. The money capital circuit focuses on the expansion of the investor's wallet.
Right.
But the text argues that to fully understand the system, we must shift our perspective and observe the process from a different starting point. This leads to the second circuit, productive capital.
Yes. Instead of starting with money, we start directly on the factory floor. The formula for the productive capital circuit is P dots C prime dash M prime dash C dots P.
So we initiate the analysis at P, the active process of production. The spinning machines are already running.
Right. The finished yarn, C prime, is taken to the market and sold for M prime. But in this circuit, the money is not the final destination. It serves purely as a transient medium.
The capitalist takes that M prime and immediately returns to the market to purchase more raw materials and labor power, represented by C.
And then the circuit concludes exactly where it began,
Yeah.
back in the realm of production, P.
So the narrative flow is produce commodities, sell them, buy new materials, produce more commodities, production leads back to production.
Exactly. And the text notes that classical economists favored this specific formulation of the circuit because it inherently obscures the driving motive of capitalist accumulation.
How does it obscure it?
It paints a picture of a system entirely focused on the continuous production of useful goods for society. It makes the industrial giant look indistinguishable from a simple peasant farmer who grows wheat, sells it for cash, and uses the cash to buy clothes and new seeds for the next harvest.
Oh, I see. It creates a veneer of natural harmony. It hides the fact that M prime is mathematically larger than the original capital and frames the entire endeavor as a cycle designed simply to fulfill human needs through continuous production.
Exactly. It makes it look completely innocent. To dismantle this illusion, the text rigorously analyzes what actually happens during the transition back to production. It divides this circuit into two distinct possibilities: simple reproduction and expanded reproduction.
Okay, let's define those. Simple reproduction assumes a scenario where the scale of the enterprise remains completely static, right?
Yes. If the capitalist extracts that 78 pounds of surplus value we calculated earlier and decides to spend every single penny of it on their own personal, unproductive consumption, luxury goods, champagne, lavish estates, they're engaging in simple reproduction.
They do not reinvest any of the extracted surplus back into the functioning capital of the business?
Right. Consequently, the next cycle of production begins with the exact same 422 pounds of advanced capital as the first. The wheel spins, but the vehicle doesn't move forward.
But the text notes that while simple reproduction is a necessary theoretical baseline, it doesn't reflect the actual driving force of capitalism. Capitalists are systemically compelled to grow, or they will be crushed by competitors.
Yes, the relentless drive for growth requires expanded reproduction.
And expanded reproduction, or accumulation, occurs when the capitalist takes a portion of that 78 pounds of surplus value and converts it back into capital. They reinvest it to buy additional constant and variable capital, more machines, more raw materials, more workers.
So the subsequent P is fundamentally larger in scale than the original P.
But here's where it gets really interesting mechanically. The physical reality of the industrial world introduces a severe friction to this process of accumulation. The text introduces the concept of the hoard, or latent money capital.
This is such a crucial concept.
Yeah.
Capitalist expansion cannot occur in continuous microscopic increments.
Yeah.
You cannot take 5 pounds of surplus value and simply purchase 1% of a new steam engine.
Right.
The physical machinery dictates strict technical proportions. To expand the spinning mill, the capitalist might need to add an entirely new section of machinery.
And the text gives a specific example of this, right? The spindles.
Yes. It notes that you might need to buy new spindles, which might cost 1 pound each. But a spindle is useless on its own. To maintain the balanced flow of the factory, a new spindle requires the simultaneous purchase of matching preparatory machinery, new carders, new roving frames, perhaps even an upgrade to the main power source to handle the additional load.
So there is a hard, physical threshold of capital required to execute an upgrade. If the capitalist's weekly surplus value does not meet that threshold, they cannot immediately reinvest it.
No, they can't.
They are structurally forced to withdraw that surplus money from the active circuit and stash it away. They must build a hoard.
Exactly.
It's kind of like playing a grand strategy game where you manage an empire.
Oh, how so?
Well, say you want to upgrade your central fortress to the next technological tier. The upgrade requires 5,000 gold and 2,000 stone. But your economy only produces 100 gold and 50 stone per turn. You cannot buy the fortress walls brick by brick.
Right, the game won't let you.
Exactly. You are forced to simply let your resources accumulate in your treasury turn after turn, doing absolutely nothing, until you finally cross the specific numerical threshold required to trigger the massive upgrade.
That is a perfect analogy. It is a state of enforced paralysis. The text emphasizes that this hoarding is not driven by the miserly greed of the individual capitalist. It is a rigid, involuntary necessity imposed upon them by the technical realities of industrial production.
And the macroeconomic consequence of this is profound. While that money is sitting in the hoard waiting to reach the threshold, it is categorized as fallow or dead capital. It is latent.
Yes, it has been entirely withdrawn from the active circuit of circulation and production, and it is generating absolutely no new surplus value.
The capitalist system demands constant fluid movement, yet its own physical mechanisms constantly force immense pools of capital into a dead, latent state. The tension between the desire for immediate reinvestment and the physical necessity of hoarding creates a constant underlying friction in the reproductive cycle.
It's a huge contradiction in the system.
So we've looked at the circuit starting from the bank account, and we've looked at it starting from the factory floor. The text then introduces the final perspective, the third circuit, commodity capital.
Right. And the formula for the commodity capital circuit is C prime dots C prime.
So we begin our observation not with money and not with active production, but with the finished commodity already containing the extracted surplus value.
Exactly. We start with the 10,000 pounds of yarn sitting in the warehouse. We trace it as it enters circulation, transforms into money, transforms back into productive elements, and the circuit only concludes when an entirely new batch of finished yarn, a new C prime, rolls off the line.
Now, the obvious question is why we need three separate formulas to describe the exact same underlying process. What unique insight does starting with the finished goods provide that the first two circuits obscured?
The third circuit obliterates the illusion that a capitalist enterprise can operate in isolation. It introduces the absolute necessity of the broader macroeconomic web. To successfully navigate the transition from M prime back to C, to turn money back into the means of production. The individual capitalist is entirely dependent on the successful operations of other capitalists.
Oh, because your spinning mill cannot conjure its inputs out of thin air. The 372 pounds you need to spend on constant capital must buy actual physical goods that exist in the world.
Precisely. Your yarn factory requires someone else's coal mine to have successfully completed its own circuit. It requires someone else's steel mill to have produced the metal for your spindles. It requires someone else's agricultural enterprise to have produced the raw cotton.
So your ability to close your C prime to C prime circuit relies completely on the successful commodity capital circuits of a vast network of other unseen capitalists. Their finished C prime must be available on the market for you to purchase as your starting C.
It demonstrates that the economy is not a collection of independent actors, but a deeply intertwined, interdependent organism. If the coal miner's circuit breaks down, or if a blight destroys the cotton crop, your spinning mill circuit violently grinds to a halt, regardless of how much money you have in the bank.
And the text highlights that this specific perspective, viewing the total social capital as a unified web of interdependent circuits, was the conceptual groundwork for François Quesnay's tableau économique.
Yes, Quesnay, writing in the 18th century, was one of the first to attempt a macroeconomic model that tracked the flow of value through the entire societal organism, recognizing that every sector's output is fundamentally required as another sector's input.
And when we look at this massive intertwined web of circulating commodities, the text introduces a critical mechanism that acts to lubricate the entire system, the merchant. It references the observations of the economist Sismondi to explain why the merchant, or the wholesaler, is an absolute structural necessity for industrial capitalism.
Right, because Sismondi recognized a fatal flaw in the timeline of the manufacturer. Our spinning mill owner cannot afford to halt their production process while they wait for ultimate consumers to walk into a shop and purchase individual spools of yarn.
Oh, yeah, that would take forever.
Exactly. If the manufacturer had to wait for the final retail consumption of their entire 10,000-pound batch before recouping their capital, the M prime would be delayed for months or years. Their capital would be hopelessly trapped in the commodity form, and the factory would have to shut down.
Because the speed of industrial production vastly outpaces the speed of individual consumption.
To solve this, the manufacturer sells the entire massive batch of yarn directly to a wholesale merchant. The merchant purchases the C prime with their own commercial capital. The manufacturer receives their M prime almost immediately.
This allows the manufacturer to rapidly restart the P phase. They can buy more cotton, pay their workers, and keep the factory running at maximum capacity, oblivious to the actual pace of consumption happening in the real world.
But this immense acceleration of the circuit comes with a terrifying systemic risk,
Why is it terrifying?
because the merchant acts as a buffer, shielding the manufacturer from the reality of the market. The manufacturer receives their money and assumes their circuit has been successfully validated by society. They pop the champagne, expand their operations, and churn out even more yarn.
But the yarn hasn't actually been consumed. It has merely changed hands from the manufacturer to the merchant's warehouse. What happens if the public simply doesn't want to buy yarn?
You have pinpointed the precise mechanical origin of commercial crises.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because the manufacturer is sold to the merchant, the reproductive process flourishes. The factory runs hot, wages are paid, and the illusion of a booming economy is maintained. But the commodities are simply piling up in massive wholesale warehouses. The stream of production continues to flow, but it is only apparently being absorbed by actual consumption.
And the merchant is financing this massive inventory buildup using credit, right?
Yeah.
They are issuing bills of exchange, promising to pay the manufacturer based on the assumption that the yarn will eventually sell.
Exactly. It's a colossal bubble built entirely on the mechanics of circulation, completely detached from the physical reality of human consumption.
So eventually, the structural limit is reached. The merchant warehouses are overflowing. The merchants can no longer secure the credit required to purchase the next incoming batch of yarn from the factory. The bills of exchange come due, and the merchants do not have the liquid cash to honor them because the ultimate consumers never bought the goods.
And then the bubble bursts. And the text makes a profoundly counterintuitive point about the nature of this collapse.
What is it?
The crisis appears on the surface to be a sudden, catastrophic collapse in consumer demand. But the reality is that the actual demand didn't suddenly disappear. It was never there to begin with. The crisis is triggered not by a lack of consumer desire, but by a sudden, desperate demand for payment.
I see. The bills come due.
Right. The merchants are forced to liquidate their vast inventories at fire sale prices just to secure enough cash to avoid bankruptcy. Prices crash, factories suddenly find no buyers for their massive output, production halts, workers are fired, and the entire interdependent web collapses in on itself.
It is a crisis strictly generated by the internal mechanics of the circulation process itself. The system's ability to artificially accelerate the realization of capital through merchant middlemen fundamentally obscures the real-world limits of the market until the overproduction reaches a fatal system-breaking threshold.
It's incredibly volatile.
And the sheer precariousness of this system leads us perfectly into the final overarching theme of the text, the unity of the three circuits and the tyranny of time.
Yes. Throughout the analysis, the text has methodically isolated these three circuits, money, productive, and commodity, to dissect their individual mechanics.
Yeah.
But it insists that in reality, a functioning capitalist enterprise does not transition sequentially from one isolated state to the next.
Right.
The actual circuit of industrial capital is the simultaneous unity of all three forms.
It is a condition of constant coexistence and succession. A healthy, functioning business must exist in all three states at the exact same moment.
Exactly. If you take a snapshot of a successful spinning mill, one portion of its total capital exists as money, currently being used to pay the weekly wages and purchase incoming coal.
Right.
Simultaneously, another massive portion of its capital is locked in the productive phase, actively operating the machines and spinning the cotton. And simultaneously, a third portion of its capital exists as finished yarn, sitting on a train, heading toward the wholesale market.
Continuity is the absolute defining hallmark of capitalist production. The capital must constantly shed one form to adopt the next, over and over, simultaneously across all its parts.
And the most dangerous entity to this simultaneous flow, the ultimate friction in the system, is time itself.
Time.
Yes, the text dedicates profound attention to this, specifically dissecting the crucial difference between labor time and production time.
Okay, labor time is straightforward. It is the specific duration when human beings are actively applying their labor power to the object of production. It is the 8 hours the worker spends physically operating the spinning machine or swinging a hammer.
But production time encompasses a much wider window.
How much wider?
Production time includes the active labor time, but crucially, it also includes the entirety of the time that the capital remains locked in the production process without any human intervention. It is the time when the physical materials are simply subjected to the elemental forces of nature.
Oh, I see. And the text provides 3 distinct organic examples that beautifully illustrate this trap, doesn't it?
It does. First, agricultural capital. You advance capital to pay workers to plow a field and sow grain. The active labor time might be a few weeks, but the grain then sits in the earth for months, governed entirely by biological processes before it can be harvested.
Right. And the second example is the production of wine. You expend labor time to harvest and crush the grapes, but the juice must then sit in a cellar fermenting for years.
And third, the tanning of leather, or hides are submerged in chemical baths and must soak for extended periods before the labor process can resume. In all of these industries, the total production time vastly exceeds the actual labor time.
And this excess time, the waiting time mandated by biology or chemistry, is a massive vulnerability for the capitalist. During those months or years, the capital is latent.
It's basically tied up.
Exactly, physically tied up in the form of fermenting wine or sprouting grain, but it is not actively absorbing any human labor. And because labor is the sole source of value creation, that capital is sitting completely idle, generating zero surplus value, while still being entirely exposed to the risks of the market and the elements.
The physical reality of the commodity actively fights against the capitalist desire for instantaneous turnover. The system desperately wants to accelerate the M-to-M prime cycle to light speed, but it's continually dragged down by the slow, unavoidable rhythms of the natural world.
And this vulnerability extends beyond the production phase into the circulation phase. The text highlights the threat of perishability.
Oh, perishability is a huge factor. If a capitalist enterprise produces a highly perishable commodity, like fresh dairy or ripe fruit, or in the 19th century, fresh meat, that physical attribute severely limits its circulation time.
Right.
The commodity must be sold and consumed almost immediately after production, or its use value, and therefore its exchange value, completely evaporates.
You cannot slowly ship 19th century milk across the continent while waiting for the optimal market price. You have to sell it today to whoever is nearby.
Exactly. This physical constraint makes it incredibly difficult to organize these industries on a purely capitalist mass production scale, unless there are incredibly dense local urban populations to absorb the immediate supply, or until a massive technological leap occurs, like the invention of refrigerated railcars.
The physical nature of the use value actively dictates the boundaries of the capital's ability to circulate. And this interconnected, highly sensitive web of production and circulation times leads to what the text defines as the elemental force of value.
Yes, because the entire social organism is so deeply interdependent and so reliant on precise timing across thousands of different circuits, the overarching system of value takes on an independent, almost aggressive life of its own.
If a severe drought in America suddenly causes the global market value of raw cotton to spike, or if a financial panic causes the price of coal to crash, these fluctuations act exactly like natural disasters against the carefully planned calculations of the individual spinning mill owner.
Right. They can't control it.
The capitalists may have perfectly managed their internal labor time and their machinery, but the autonomous elemental movement of value in the broader market can completely obliterate their circuit without warning. The system operates automatically through the blind interactions of millions of commodities, but it is structurally deeply precarious.
It really is. It's a miracle it functions at all some days.
So we've covered an immense theoretical landscape today. Let's synthesize the mechanics of this hidden cardiovascular system. We started by isolating the oxygen of the entire process.
We saw how the classical economists observed profit, but couldn't explain its origin, until Marx isolated surplus value as the direct mathematical result of the difference between the cost of maintaining labor power and the actual value that labor can create.
We tracked that surplus value as it flowed through the money capital circuit, noting how the outward appearance of M to M prime creates the potent illusion that money itself possesses the magical ability to self-reproduce, entirely obscuring the extraction of labor on the factory floor.
Then we shifted our perspective to the productive capital circuit, where we discovered that the physical requirements of industrial machinery force capitalists to involuntarily withdraw massive amounts of surplus value from the active economy.
Hoarding it as dead, latent capital until they reach the technical thresholds required for expansion.
Right. We examined the commodity capital circuit and mapped the immense interdependent web of the macroeconomy. We saw how the necessary intervention of wholesale merchants allows manufacturers to artificially accelerate their individual circuits,
Unknowingly building massive, hidden bubbles of overproduction that ultimately violently collapse in a crisis of payment.
and finally, we saw how this entire simultaneous continuous flow of capital is constantly engaged in a desperate war against the physical limitations of the natural world, battling against the biological necessity of fermentation, the slow growth of crops, and the sudden rot of perishable goods.
You are no longer just looking at the skin and bones of the city. You understand the physiological mechanics, the strict historical prerequisites, and the internal contradictions that keep the colossal machine moving.
It's a completely different way to look at the world.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to consider that builds upon the profound limitations we just discussed. This entire 19th century analysis demonstrates how capitalism is inherently constrained, almost desperately so, by the physical realities of time and space. The time it takes wheat to grow, the time it takes a physical train to deliver coal, the time it takes a machine to rust. The system constantly fights to accelerate the M to M prime cycle, but it keeps hitting the hard wall of physical friction.
Right, the natural limits.
But consider the architecture of our modern digital economy. What happens to the foundational laws when the commodity being produced is a software application, a digital streaming file, or an algorithmic service? A digital commodity can be perfectly duplicated infinitely at essentially zero marginal cost. It does not rot, it does not rust, and most importantly, it can be distributed globally to 1 billion consumers simultaneously at the exact speed of light.
That's a wild thing to think about.
What happens to the intricate balance of the system when the time of circulation effectively drops to zero? Does a frictionless, instantaneous digital circuit fundamentally break the 19th century laws of capitalist reproduction? Or does it merely strip away the biological brakes, accelerating the extraction of surplus value and the formation of commercial bubbles to an uncontrollable, blistering speed that human perception can no longer even track?
Wow.
Next time you instantly download an update or watch a digital purchase appear in your account the millisecond you click buy, think about the circuits of capital moving without friction. Think about the invisible blood of the economy pumping silently all around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.